series, Outsiders. We're talking about how we are not of this world. It says that in John 17. Jesus was not of this world, and if we follow Jesus, we are not of this world. This means they're not our final home, right? We live outside of culture and society, the things that the world falls into, the evils that it falls into, the temptations that the world brings. We live outside of that. So we're talking about everything that we believe and how it clashes with culture and it clashes with society. And we want to know, hey, what's the truth? Because if there's this thing that's up in the air, what is the truth about it? If it's not one thing or another, we want to know what the truth is. And the first thing we talked about was Scripture. So if we point everything to Scripture, and Scripture is the ultimate truth, then that's our foundation, that's where we start. So that everything goes back to that, then we know, hey, if Scripture is legitimate, if it's accurate, then we know everything that we pull from that is truth, and it is the truth that we stand on, right? So then last week we talked about God, and we said, okay, if the Bible is true, then everything that we talk about God is in that, and we know that God is real, right? So this week, we're kind of going to build off of that discussion. We're going to talk about Jesus. We're going to talk about Jesus. So this builds off the Bible discussion because while God is often mentioned in the Bible, He never was seen by physical man. So God the Father was never actually seen by man. His glory is too radiant. His glory is too bright. His glory is too glory for us because we are sinners. Right? We can only see Him through Christ. And then one day when we are glorified, we'll be in His presence. But until then, you can't. So while Moses encountered God through a bush and on the mountain, he never actually laid his physical eyes on Him. But he was close enough. Moses was close enough that when he came down from the Ten Commandments, he was actually up there a year. When he came down from receiving the Ten Commandments, the people looked upon Moses because he was glowing so much with God's radiance, because he was near the presence of God's radiance, His beauty, His might. Right? So while He's never mentioned, you can understand, all right, well, that's God in the Bible. Bible mentions it several times, but when you get to Jesus, right, well, you can see God through Scripture, but Jesus was an actual, living, breathing, fleshed human whose life is recorded in detail in Scripture. Right? So a lot of the first evidence of proving Jesus is proving that Scripture is legitimate. And we did that. Right? So in other words, this discussion could have been a lot longer, but since we already did the other half of proving Scripture, then we're just going to go ahead and go on to Jesus. All right? So, my question to you, who was the first president of the United States of America? How do you know that? Right. Could you prove scientifically, not historically, can you prove scientifically that George Washington was the first president of the United States?
He found his bones.
Found his bones and then what?
You can see how it did.
So? You can find what? Think his bones are in the Oval Office desk or something? No. Listen, Washington never lived in the White House. The White House wasn't built until 1801. Jefferson was the first occupant. The Oval Office we know now wasn't built until Theodore Roosevelt was there in the 1900s. Right? So, how do you know? Well, there's historical documents, right? There's history books, there's writings, there's physical things, and historical side that we know that George Washington was the first president. How do you know Abraham Lincoln was president? The same thing, through historical evidence. Right? So not everything can be proved from a scientific standpoint. Right? Why? Because not everything that was can be measured, observed, and repeated, which is the basics of the scientific method. Right? Measure, observe, repeat. Well, you can't repeat Abraham Lincoln being president. You can't repeat George Washington being president. So while you can't prove it scientifically, no one is going to contradict that George Washington was president, the first president of the United States. Because it's historically proven. So, the same thing goes for Jesus. His historical evidence is numerous. It's numerous. It even goes outside of Scripture. So why is there doubt that Jesus was a real person, that Jesus ever lived? There shouldn't be doubt because it's just historical evidence that we have. So our goal tonight is to prove not only was Jesus real, but that He died and rose again, right? And there was this idea introduced by a guy named C.S. Lewis. He's a famous author. He introduced this idea of liar, lunatic, and Lord. So Jesus had to be one of those things. Either he had to constantly lie about who he was, which would make him a liar, or he claimed all these things and was a lunatic, while He claimed it all, these people that followed him, but it really didn't happen. He was a lunatic. He thought he was all that stuff, but it really wasn't. Or, all of it is true and he is Lord. He's either a liar, a lunatic, or Lord. And so tonight, we're going to see why he wasn't a liar, why there's no way he could be a lunatic, and so thus he had to be Lord. Right? But first, I want you to understand who was Jesus. How many of you have seen this? Who is that? It's a candle. It's a candle. Right? How many of you have seen this picture of Jesus? How many of you think Jesus actually looked like that? None of you. Why?
Because he was an Asian, and he was probably like really tan, had black hair.
Did you say he was Asian? Technically it's Asia, right? So, there's a few things wrong with this. Number one, he's white. Jesus is not a Caucasian male, right? He's not. The second thing that's wrong with this is he's really pretty, right? And it literally says in Scripture, I think it's in Isaiah, right, Megan? Yes, she knows. She's back there. She's 8 months pregnant. But it's her birthday. Everybody turn around and wave at Megan and say, happy birthday. Happy birthday! She's 29. I'm 35. You can do the math later. So Jesus was not pretty, right? He's got like eyeshadow on, and he's real pretty. In other words, you may not think he's cute. No, right? So you may not think he's cute, but the people who drew him with mostly of the facial features that would make a man attractive, right? So, he's attractive. Listen, it says in Isaiah that he was nothing to behold. In other words, if you looked at him, you'd be like, he's just an average guy. He wasn't this glorious, radiant, constant being of this long, flowing hair and this perfect beard and these robes. He was nothing to behold. He was a poor carpenter. And for his whole ministry, he didn't even have a bed to sleep on. He either slept in the streets, or he slept outside, or he borrowed someone's, like, maybe their stable, or he borrowed a bed, or he borrowed the floor in their house. He was nothing to behold. Now, a while back, the BBC did this show, and they took, wasn't actually Jesus, right? But it was a Middle Eastern man of that time, and they kind of said what most of these guys would look like. And this is a lot closer to what Jesus really looked like. Whoa. Listen, see? But it's a lot different, because you always had this picture in your mind of, oh, Jesus, right? You have this in your mind. But really, if you saw that, you'd be like, oh, that's Jesus, definitely. But if you saw this guy, some of you may run. Right? But what I'm getting is this. We have this picture, this idea of Jesus that isn't wrong. It's Americanized, right? This picture of Jesus, this one right here that most people know, this is from the Byzantine Empire. So like, oh, he's this saint. He should be upheld. He should be this holy thing. How many of you have been in a Catholic church and there's saints and they're all pictured like this, right? With radiance and the flowing robes and all this. Listen, he was a poor man. This is most likely what he looked like. Right? Not exactly. No, that's exactly what it looks like when we get to heaven. We'll be like, hey, I've seen you before. But that's about what he looked like. He wouldn't have long hair. He was a carpenter. He worked with his hands. And, I don't know, girls, if you ever work with your hands, you look down, your hair's in the way. Right? You got to pull it out of the way. So, this is most likely what he looked like. But we have to understand and get this idea of who Jesus was. He wasn't something to behold, but he was a real man. So, was Jesus a real person? That's the first question we're going to ask. Was Jesus a real person? Alright? So, did Jesus even exist? Because if he never lived, it doesn't matter. We can pack up and go home. Let's just play Xbox. Right? But, if he was, then we have to understand who he was. So, was Jesus a real person? Well, the first thing we have to look at is historical writings. Historical writings. And the biggest one, like we already talked about, the one that we've already gone over, the first one is the Bible. Is the Bible. The first historical writing is the Bible. So, we proved its historical accuracy. We said that there was over 25,000 manuscripts of Scripture available that understand, hey, this is a legitimate, strong book. It's historical accurate. It's legitimate. Alright? So, we have the Bible is the first thing. And in the Gospels, there's endless verses that talk about Jesus. A lot of the Old Testament has prophecy towards him, but the Gospels pretty much lay out his life as a whole, and then everything after that points back to him. And then Revelation talks about his second coming. So there's this book that has him everywhere in it, right? So that's a historical writing, so he proved it. So that's the first thing. The second thing is non-Christian historians. Non-Christian historians. So the first one is the Bible. The second is non-Christian historians. Now, why is it important that they're non-Christian? Right? They believe them, right? They have, in other words, they have no reason, no purpose to go, oh, hey, let me write about this Jesus guy just to prove this Christianity is real. Well, if they're not Christian, they wouldn't care or be biased towards that, right? So a lot of these guys, some of you may know, right? Tacitus, Lucian, Suetonius, Phileni, Tullius, Phlegon, Mara. You ever heard of those guys? No? Right? You probably wouldn't. I think the only ones you might have heard of is Pliny. But, she's heard of Pliny, right? No?
Yeah, no, I have heard.
Pliny. Right, so these are historical writers. Most of them were Roman, and some of them lived during Jesus' time, and they all write of this man, known as Christ, or known as Jesus, that Pilate killed. Because they were Roman historians, Pilate was a governor of that area, so they all understand, hey, this guy, and most of them were doing so and complaining about Christians, like, hey, these Christians that they were persecuting at the time, these Christians that followed this guy Christ, who Pilate killed, he really didn't know what he was doing, he really started something. It's basically what most of the writers are saying. So, we have non-Christians writing about this guy Jesus. Alright, well they have no motivation to lie, and so maybe he was a real man. The second thing, number 3 is Jewish historians. Jewish historians. Now, we're going to get into Judaism a little later, but the Jews have no reason to further the life of Christ. Because while back then they understood who he was, and they're the ones who put him to death, they do not believe he was the Messiah, or they wouldn't have done that. Right? And so they have no reason, no motivation to try to prove Jesus is real. But this historian by the name of Josephus, who's a very well-known Jewish historian, he wrote a lot about Jesus. A lot. Right? He wrote extensively on the history of Jewish culture, which included the life and ministry of Christ. Right? So none of these men were Christian, so they had no motivation to falsify history and to add it on there. Right? Number B, the calendar. The calendar. Now I wouldn't go and argue this with someone, but this is legit. Our calendar is centered on what? Huh? Right? Jesus' birth. Listen, what year is it?
2020.
2020. Now, is our earth, the world, only 2,020 years old?
No.
No. Right? How many of you have heard of BC or BCE, as I'll tell you? In other words, BCE, but you have to count the other way. So, BCE, they say, is before Common Era. Before they came up with that, it was actually known as before Christ. But they wanted to take him out of the picture, so they said before Common Era. And then CE is Common Era, but really it's AD, which is Anno Domini, which is in the year of our Lord. Right? But, in other words, it's centered around something. It's centered around something. Now, we follow the Gregorian calendar, which means nothing to you. But basically, it was written back in Roman times, in ancient times. But those guys felt that this birth of this guy was so significant that, hey, let's just count all the time from that. Why? So what happened, right? Now that we can be more accurate with our time, we understand that Jesus was probably born around 4 or 6 BC. By the way, not on December 25th, but that's okay. Right? He's most likely born in the summertime. But it's when we celebrate the birth of Jesus. That's not actually his birthday. We don't get into that. But, so we know, but it was around that time. So those guys felt, hey, something happened significant enough of this person that we're pretty much going to base all of time on. Everything before this guy was born, we're going to count up from there. And everything from there, we're going to count it. That was significant. It can't just be nothing. The calendar isn't based off of me. July 24th, 1984 is not significant to any of you. But not to any of you. And my mom. And now my wife. But it's a significant thing to be like, hey, maybe there's something that happened there. Maybe there's a bit more that we need to understand. Last is the church. The church. The church. once again. Do I look crazy? Kind of, right? All of you crazy. Now, if you think I'm crazy and then you're sitting here listening to me, that makes you crazier. Just saying. But we're not crazy. We're not crazy. And people for thousands of years aren't crazy. So how could the church, and I'm talking about the universal church, means all believers since Christ's death, all of them aren't crazy. So all of us wouldn't follow this imaginative figure, and no one during those thousands of years go, you know what, let's research if this is really real. Right? If it's based off of those guys who saw his ministry, and witnessed his ministry, and then went forth and shared that, and constantly shared that and shared it in the growth of the gospel, and then now we have this huge, what we call the universal church, all believers. You're telling us all of us are following someone who didn't exist? Those odds aren't real. Right? How do you believe in unicorns? Right? Exactly. Why? Because you know they're not real. Now, are they fun? Are they cute? Sometimes. I think a horse with a horn is kind of scary. But you do your own thing. They can fly on rainbows? Terrifying. That's terrifying, people. That's terrifying. But, right? You know it's not real. So, real fast. Hey, listen. So there's not this unicorn society that honestly believes you would say, those people are weird. Right? But no one looks at the universal church and goes, hey, those guys are following someone that's not real. So we had to be following something. Everyone in history at that time had to do, someone's going to do research and understanding. Right? So there's evidence that proves, man, Jesus was real. Jesus was a real person. And the most thing is the historical writings of saying, hey, he was real. So now that we know he is real, the next question is, all right, did he die? That one, don't write it down, right? So I'm going to ask you. But as understand, it's real fast. It's kind of an instant question. If someone that lived 2,000 years ago, do you think they're dead? Right? So even if you didn't believe Jesus rose again, you would think, oh, well, he definitely died. Right? And then all the historical writings said, hey, he was crucified. Pilate did put him to death by our method. So you're like, okay, if he did die, then what's the next logical question is, well, did Jesus rise from the dead? So if he was a real person, we know he had to die at some point. And historically it says he was put to death on the cross, on the crucifixion. And so, but did he rise from the dead? Joe, what's great? You guessed great. I did that already. Did he rise from the dead? Right? The first thing he did was he predicted it. He predicted it. A prediction. Prediction. So, from here on out, there's going to be a lot of scripture. So Mark 8:31 says this, and he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. That's Christ telling these people, I will rise again. He did it again in John 11:25. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. He said, I am the resurrection and the life. Not only meaning he's going to resurrect, but those who believe in him will suffer death, but will actually live from that. Again in John 2. So the Jews said to him, what sign do you show us for doing these things? Jesus answered him, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. And the Jews said to him, it's taken 46 years to build this temple. You'll raise it up in 3 days? They weren't very smart. But he was speaking about the temple of his body. So he says, hey, you will destroy this temple, this body, but I will raise it up in 3 days. So he's making his own prediction of himself. Of man, the resurrection. So if he's a real person, he's talking about this, it means something. The next is the witnesses. The witnesses. Right? So not only did he predict his own resurrection, right? When he did resurrect, he showed himself to people. These are the witnesses, all right? And here's a bunch of them right here. Mary Magdalene can be found in John 20, right? Then he showed himself to some other women in Matthew 28. He showed himself to Peter and Luke, 2 disciples again in Luke, 10 disciples later on in Luke. And then Thomas, you remember doubting Thomas, right? He wanted to put his hands in the holes. And others in John, right? And the one with Thomas, he walked through a door. So like, imagine this. I'm playing Jesus. Just for this little, but like, just be talking. Someone talk about Jesus. Say Jesus. Say, oh, I don't believe Jesus rose from the dead. Say it now.
I believe Jesus rose from the dead.
No.
I don't believe Jesus rose from the
What's up, Ben? Everybody get it? That's what he did. Listen, if you read, that's literally what he did. Doubting Thomas is going, I don't believe until I can put my hands in the holes and put my hands in his side and understand who it did. And Jesus at that moment, he didn't use doorways. So imagine that was a wall. Jesus walks through the wall and goes, what's up, Thomas? Thomas is, so he's forever known as Doubting Thomas. But that's what he did. And then again, the 7 disciples, and then all the apostles, and then all the apostles again, which was more than just 12 apostles, not disciples. Then he showed himself to James and Paul. Listen, that's a lot of witnesses. Hey, that's a lot of witnesses. And that's not even all of them. In 1 Corinthians 15:6 it says this. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time. At one time. One time. So it was well over 500 people. And some people want to say, well, maybe they were hallucinating. Really? Really? Because if, listen, Mary Magdalene went to the grave was empty.